Hi there. A lot of people have been asking me to show my process for how I make bread. I try to do it in as simple steps as possible because I want to be able to do it frequently and not have it be a whole big deal. So I thought I'd show you real quick how I do it the simplest way. There's ways to do this a little more complex, and if that's something you're interested in, I can show you that too in a separate video, but I thought I'd go ahead and show you. So first step is to get us a nice cup of coffee and figure out what we're doing here. So in a minute we'll come in closer and I'll show you exactly what I'm doing, but let's go onto the computer here, and this is a spreadsheet that I made, and I'll share a link to this in the description below. And what this does is it allows us to customize the recipe according to whatever size or number of loaves or whatever it is we want to make. One thing I would recommend if you really want to try bread baking a little more seriously or a little more consistently would be to get a digital scale. You could use an analog scale too, but the digital scales are not that expensive and they will massively improve the results that you get and the consistency of the products that you get. So this is very simple. That we wanted the total amount of dough that we're going to do. So today I'm going to do 2 16-ounce loaves. You might want to do 1 24-ounce loaf. So if you change that, it'll give you these changes over here. I'm using ounces because I am a Luddite American, but if you wanted to do grams, like if you wanted to do a 500-gram loaf, you could use 500 here too. So I'm going to do 32 because what I'm looking for is 2 16-ounce loaves. And so over here, these are giving you, this first number tells you roughly how wet the dough is. So 60% hydration versus 65% versus 70%. I won't go too deep into that because it's called the baker's percentage, and this is 2% salt, 2% yeast. If you want to learn about that, you can go Google that and nerd out like I would. But for right now, as you move this way, the wetter the loaf is, and also the wetter a loaf is, it tends to have a little bit more of the big bubbles in the crumb, in the inside. So for today, we're going to go for this 65% because we're just going to make a very simple, basic, regular kind of sandwichy type loaf, and yeah. Okay, so ingredients. The ingredients that I am going to use today, again, I'm going to keep it pretty simple: flour, salt, yeast, and water. So I am using today this Weisenberger Mill whole wheat blend. This is, I would recommend this for these types of loaves. It's kind of a blend. I'll show you the consistency here. It's kind of a blend of whole wheat with a lot of that extra bran in there, but also it's got a little bit of the consistency of a regular bread flour or a all-purpose flour. It works really well if you want to do whole wheat, but you don't want to. If you don't want to go down the route of trying to figure out how to work with whole wheat to make a really great loaf, this is a good starting point. Whole wheat flour can be a little challenging to work with, especially as you first start. The other thing I'm using is this instant yeast. I prefer instant yeast because you don't have to prove it. You can add it just like another dry ingredient. I think this bag, I got this at Good Foods Co-op, and it cost me, I think, $5 or $6. And if you bake as much as I do, which is a lot, this will probably last you still 6 months. If you don't bake as much, it could last you years. And I just keep it in a Ziploc bag in the fridge. So that's what it looks like when you pull it out. And then the other thing I'm using is just salt. Some people get real fussy about the type of salt that they use. I don't really have those hang-ups. The one thing I will mention, I'm going to show you here how much each of these is roughly using volume measurements, because I know many of you don't have scales. But salt in particular is kind of hard because you have coarse salt. It has more air pockets inside those crystals. I'm not going to go too far down this rabbit hole, but the volume measurements for coarse salt and fine salt are different for the same amount of total saltiness. So if you want to do this, I'll show you the measurements here, and I'll go ahead and do that. And then the other is just tap water. Again, people sometimes get real fussy about water. There's all kind of myths about chlorine killing stuff and whatever else it may be. You can use, I use tap water for my sourdough. I use tap water for my regular bread. So again, don't get too hung up on anything. It's supposed to be simple. People have been baking bread for thousands of years. Yeah, let's get to it. So we'll start. I'll start with the yeast here, and I'm gonna measure these out. The measurements are actually a little under 0.4 ounces, but I'm gonna do volume here just to show you what that is roughly. So this is a tablespoon. It's roughly a tablespoon, and then maybe half a teaspoon, just if you're playing along at home. Again, I measured these out on the scale, which was, I think, $35 total. And then the next one is salt. I ran out of fine salt, so I'm doing a blend of fine and coarse. But again, I measured this out by weight, but by volume, for whatever it's worth, maybe 3/4 of a tablespoon, maybe half a tablespoon. This isn't a huge deal. You know, if you put in 4 tablespoons or no salt at all, you would definitely notice. But if you did a full tablespoon, it might be a little saltier, might slow down the yeast a little bit, but overall, I'm gonna throw it in there. Okay, so I'm just gonna grab a fork here and just mix this. You can see I haven't added anything wet yet. I'm just mixing everything. And again, I'm using instant yeast. If you want to use active dry yeast, you're going to need to prove it, I believe, put it in some water. I haven't used it that much, so. All right, and so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take my water, which you can find the measurements for this. I think it was a little over 12 ounces by weight. I'm going to pour this in here. And I use the measurements, I use the weights not as a tool to be super, super precise. I'm not big into precision on things like this, where I'm just trying to make something that I like to eat and enjoy the process of making. But the consistency, to know that you're in the ballpark, especially on those dry ingredients, is why I'm using it. So I'll say, you know, it's around 12 ounces by weight, but I'm not like super, super hung up on the exact percentages, because again, we're doing this for me to eat. I'm not a professional. If you are looking to get some really, really great bread and you live in the central Kentucky area, I would highly recommend the Bluegrass Baking Company. I will go there periodically and buy bread to remind myself of what professional bread tastes like. Stuff we make here is really, really good, and it tastes, in most cases, it tastes just as good, but it's not quite as pretty, not quite as consistent, but hey. All right, so I'm just mixing this until it gets to kind of a rough, scraggly looking consistency. Right now, this flour has been dry for quite a while, and we're exposing it to water, so we want to allow some time for that water to soak in and hydrate the dough. So we're going to give that about 20 minutes, and we'll come back and we'll check it out. So it's been about 20 minutes, and we let the dough hydrate, we let the water soak in, especially with the whole wheat, into that bran, into that stuff that has all the fiber that we're looking for. And now we're going to turn it out onto the counter, and we're going to work with it and knead it a little bit, and well, yeah, we'll see where that takes us. When I do this, I like to have a little bit of water on hand, just to help me keep it from sticking to my hands. You could use flour as well. I tend to use water during this first part and then flour later. So you can see it's real rough still, but it is considerably moister than it was before. And this technique of kneading is something that some people, with a drier loaf, you tend to probably do a little more kneading. If it were a little bit more of a moist, a higher percentage of water, you might need to stretch and fold, but that's all more advanced. We'll just stick with what we got here and knead this. And I usually will set a timer for about 10 minutes, because if you're kneading by hand, it's easy to be like, oh, I think I'm done, and it's only been 2 minutes, and your gluten development isn't there, and blah, 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 blah. But I'm going to switch this over to a time lapse and we will watch me do this for 10 minutes. So, as you're working, you might pinch off a little bit here. And then you you're looking, this is what's called a window pane test. And so as you stretch it, you start to be able to see light coming through some of the real thin parts. I'm not sure if you can see that or not, but it's still tearing a little bit. That's a good test, especially when you first start working with bread, to see if that gluten is developed the way that you'd like it to. Alright, final stretch here. Last minute or so. That's for the 10 minutes. And the 10-minute timeline is that's not set in stone. It could be, depending on what you're working with, that you need less or you need more. If you do that window pane test, I can already tell the gluten in this is pretty close to where it needs to be. Let's see if I can pull off a little bit for a window pane test. So what you're trying to do is and with whole wheat, it can be kind of challenging and not super helpful, but it's getting pretty thin, and we can kind of see the light coming through there. I'm going to give it the full 10 minutes here. Send it into hyperdrive for this last little bit. Pinch off a little bit here. Let's see if we can't. I'm not sure if you can see the light coming. I wouldn't worry about that little tear. You can see the light. It's much clearer. So it's not tearing. That's actually kind of the thin membrane. You can see that through. That's what you're looking for. With whole wheat, it's hard to get that. If we had a regular white bread, it'd be much more clear. That stuff's crazy stretchy. So I'm going to take this, I'm going to put it back into my bowl, and I'm going to let that proof or rise or bulk ferment, whatever you want to say, for about an hour and a half. And so we'll come back and check on it after that. Okay, so the next step here, we've gotten it to rise for about an hour and a half. This will probably vary a little bit depending on temperature, but it's a pretty good bet. Now the next step here is to shape the bread. I'm gonna grab some flour here. I think that this is the most challenging or the trickiest part. It's the part that requires the most practice, and it's one of the areas where you'll see the biggest difference between amateur at home kind of bread and a bakery. Their consistency on shaping and other stuff like that is just much higher. So might need a little more flour at some point, but for right now this is fine. I'm just using all-purpose here. You could use bread flour, you could use the stuff we use for the main thing. I think all-purpose is probably the cheapest for me, so I'm using one of these bread spatula things. You could use just a regular spatula just to get the dough out here. I'll try not to beat it up too bad. And I'm just going to use the other side of this, and I'm going to maybe dust it with a little bit of flour here. And if you wanted to, you could weigh these. I'm just going to eyeball about half and half, give or take. Doesn't matter that much. And so this next part is called shaping. So I'll do one kind of quickly here. I'll shape this. We're going to do it in 2 stages. We're going to shape it into its initial form, and then we'll do a final shaping after it rests for a second. So right now it's real stretchy. It's easy to stretch. You'll see the difference here after we shape this. So I'm just going to do the first one here quickly. Tuck this in, tuck this in, tuck this in. I'm just kind of trying to stick it. And we're going to make this eventually into a longer, elongated loaf. Not quite like a baguette, more like a batard, but you can see already it's bouncing back much more. So after we've kind of moved everything to the center, I'm going to take, and I don't know what you call this, Mickey Mouse ears or something like that. You take and you pull in, ear, ear, and then tuck that in, spin it around, and pinch it closed. All right, so that was the fast one. We'll slow it down now. Okay, so that's the quick way. Now I'll slow everything down a whole lot more on the second one. I always like to see the actual process first. And keep in mind, this is just the first shaping. So this is not what the final loaf is gonna necessarily look like. So first I try to just kind of make the shape more or less uniformly into a circle. So we have these longer pieces here. Let's tuck those in, tuck it in. This doesn't have to stick perfectly. You can see it's coming up, but just push it into the middle and then tuck it in, tuck it in, tuck it in, just like that. Don't be afraid to spin the dough as you go. Tuck it, tuck it, tuck it. And like I said, this is the hardest, in my opinion, this is the most challenging part of making really good bread. This won't really affect the taste much at all. If you do a poor job of shaping, you can keep it from getting as tall and as full as you might like, but the taste is going to be really good. So again, we got this kind of into a ball here. If you were going to make a round loaf, this would be the shape you were shooting for in any case, but since we're doing a longer loaf, excuse me, we're going to go ahead and do this Mickey Mouse ear, and tuck this guy in, spin the whole thing around, and just fold this all the way over. And we've got kind of this, almost like a hot dog bun, and then just close it up. And if it's sticking to your fingers, just take and get a little flour on your fingers and it won't stick anymore. We don't want to add crazy amounts of flour to this, just because we don't want to dry it out anymore. We want the more or less the percentage we were shooting for. Okay, so now you can see if I pull this, it bounces back pretty quickly. That's because the gluten is not relaxed anymore. It's very tense. If you push a dough too far that is not relaxed, it will tear. It'll break. It's kind of like, people. If you push them too far when they are too tense, it's not a good result's going to happen. So just like with people, step away for a few minutes, let everything chill. So we're gonna let it hang out here on the counter, room temperature, for about 5 minutes. When we come back, we'll see that the gluten is relaxed a little bit. Okay, so our next step is to do the final shaping. So we got everything kind of in place, and you can take a look here. It's still springing back pretty good, but not nearly as fast as it was when we had first shaped it. It was really almost like a rubber band. Now it's just springing back gently. This is perfectly good for this final shaping. So we're going to basically do the same thing we did last time, except we're not going to do that initial step of getting it into a ball. We got a nice shape here. We want to kind of keep that elongation. So again, I'm going to, something I didn't mention before, but pay attention to where your seam is, where you've joined the thing together. We want that to ultimately end up down on the pan or on the stone or whatever in the oven. If you do it the same way every time, it's easy to remember. I always do seam up on this part and then seam down. No, I always do seam up. So the seam is up here. It's easy. You can see that one's a little harder to see, but so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to do the Mickey Mouse ear thing again. Tuck, tuck, tuck. And I might even go crazy here and do it on the other side. This is just building a nice belly on the loaf. And then just take, once you get that like that, get your kind of hot dog bun shape there. Hopefully you can see that. And we'll join those together. And this is where it really is important to get this seam closed up. And if you're sticking, just get a little flour on your fingertips. Okay. So now we've got our general shape. And this is going to expand probably both directions as it proves a second time and then in the oven too. So what I want this to end up being a little bit longer than it is right now. So I'm going to take, and I'm just going to make sure my seam is nice and sealed up. And it won't end up being this exaggerated in the final product. Take it and just kind of, this is another technique that it just takes some practice and being gentle. A lot of the shaping is just blending gentle and firm. It's just practice. Making the individual loaves is not that expensive, so make a bunch and give them away and make friends. I didn't mean that to sound as sad as it came across. So that one to me looks like it's pretty good. So I'm going to set that aside. Okay. And again, I'm just going to take and I'm going to pull, I said, I don't know, the little ear thing, tuck it, ear thing and tuck it, and bring that into the middle here. And you could just go straight over, which is what I'll do now, to make your hot dog bun. And then just pinch that seam closed all the way up. You're trying to kind of form this skin around the outside, which will eventually become your crust. And so any weak spots in that crust, like I just created right there when it tore, will eventually burst, and it'll create just like a burst out, flared out section of the loaf. But I think that'll be okay. Just dry that skin out. I'm going to close up this seam, and you can see there, and we want them to be both roughly the same length. I think this one had a little more dough in it, which is fine, but roughly the same length, so we'll just kind of stretch it out there. And now I'm just going to dust these lightly with flour. That was a little more than light, but that's okay. And I'm doing again seam up all the way until I put it in the oven. And we will let those proof for about 45 minutes. So for the next step while this is proofing here, I wanted to show you a couple of the things that I use. This is just a simple pizza stone. It's nothing crazy. I think it was $20 or $25, something like that. This is all that I have ever used to make my bread. Some people use really thick stones, and I completely understand why. This is just what we do. If you put it, I think it's kind of on the middle rack is perfect. The other item that I use is a simple, inexpensive, again, just pizza peel. You don't have to use this. You could use a cutting board, or you could use anything that you can maneuver around. This one's really, really lightweight, and I don't care if it gets all charred up when I make pizza or bread or whatever. Those are the only two things really that I use that are specialized at all. Just a regular old cheap Frigidaire electric oven. So yeah, we'll let it proof and we'll put them in the oven. Okay, I'm preheating my oven to 500 degrees with a pizza stone in it. If you wanted to use a baking sheet or a loaf pan, you could certainly do that. I would probably do it at a lower temperature, maybe like 400, 450, somewhere in there. But I'm going to use the pizza stone and get that going right now while it's still proofing. With the pizza stone or with anything like that that is able to take on heat and hold it, you really want to preheat for longer than you typically would, just because it lets the whole oven and all that thermal mass come up to temperature. So our last steps here are to take and put the bread onto the peel, onto the wooden peel, and then take and put that into the oven. This way that I do that is I take and I put the peel down, and I add semolina flour, or you can also use cornmeal. You could just use the regular same flour that you used before. I find that cornmeal or semolina works a little better, and that's going to just help it to move freely on the peel. We take it over, put it in the oven, and then an optional step is to take and throw some water into the oven, either against the side of the oven or in a pan or something like that, and that'll help a little bit with some of the crust development. Then the last step, once you get all that done, you've been opening and closing the door and the temperature has dropped in the oven. That's the reason we preheated to 500 in the first place. So then you turn the oven down to 450 degrees and then just bake the bread for 15-20 minutes. Check it, and you'll probably need to add between 5 and 10 more minutes, depending on. So total bake time, somewhere probably between 26 and 32 minutes at that temperature for this type of loaf. It's very important that you let the loaves cool when they come out of the oven. If you don't, what you cut into it, all the inside will just leak out. So really let them cool for at least 20 to 30 minutes. Ideally let them cool all the way down. I know it's hard to resist, but give it at least 20 to 30 minutes to really cool down. If you're worried about whether the bread is done or not, you can take it and turn it upside down and knock on it. And if you hear kind of a hollow sound, that's what you're shooting for. The other thing, if you have a meat thermometer and you can check inside, I think it's somewhere around 205 to 210 Fahrenheit is what you're looking for on the inside. If you go for that 28 to 32 minutes, you should be in good shape. But if you want to double check, that's what you can do. Something I forgot to mention is you want to do some slashes on the top or some scores on the top. This is a specialized tool. It's called a lame, L-A-M-E, I believe is how you pronounce it. You could use a regular razor blade. That's all this is a razor blade on a curved thing. You could also use a knife, but you do want to slash it because it'll tell the bread which direction to expand. So I'm just going to make these kind of traditional slashes That's another thing you can read about how to do that the best. And now we're just going to go into the oven. And then our last step is just to take and pull them out of the oven, move them onto a cooling rack, and leave them there for 20 to 30 minutes. I'll shoot some video of the results, and yeah, I'll talk to you soon.